in this third section, we will talk about the globalization and the advent of Western fast food to South Korean market. And that happened in the middle of 1980s. As we have learned, formerly, the most popular eating out food in South Korea were Chinese food. There was jjajangmyeon and jjampong and dumpling and so on. However, it was in this time in 1980s, now gradually this food was replaced by more Western fast food such as hamburgers. In South Korea, the hamburger was, of course, was available through US military bases, but for ordinary people, it was after 1979 when the Japanese company Lotteria that came from Japan opened its first shop in Seoul in 1979. And they sold hamburgers, cheeseburgers, and milkshakes, and so on. And by mid-1980s, because of South Koreans' increased income, the global fast food chains paid attention to South Korean market, and they were arriving in South Korea one by one, almost at the same time in mid-1980s. So Burger King arrived in 1984, KFC, now this is a real KFC, Kentucky Fried Chicken arrived in 1984, and American Family Restaurant Wendy's chain came 1984, and McDonald's in 1986. And 1985, also the famous American pizza chains, global pizza chains, as a matter of fact, such as Domino's Pizza and Pizza Hut also arrived in South Korean market. As I said, the first fast food chain in South Korea came with Lotteria. As a matter of fact, Lotteria is a Korean-Japanese person, Shin-kyo Ko's company, that he established this Lotteria group, or Lotte Group, in 1948 in Japan. And his company produced confectionery, particularly chewing gum, and they became a dominant player in that industry in Japan, and they became much bigger. And they established confectionery industry in South Korea in 1967. And the first Lotteria opened its first shop in 1972 and in Seoul, and they were selling, as I said, hamburgers, cheeseburgers, and milkshakes, and so on. So that was the first time that ordinary Koreans came to have hamburgers. And this, because they were the first one that brought this Western food, they were first company that were hiring arbeit people, the part-time, mostly students who worked there. And also later they developed the localized burger, such as a bulgogi burger. And by 2000, Lotteria opened its shops in several Asian countries, including Vietnam, China, Kazakhstan, and Mongolia, and so on. And accordingly, in 2017, the chain has more than 1,300 restaurants throughout the country. So in this image, you see that this Lotteria, the first Lotteria opened in Seoul in 1979. You see they were wearing the westernized uniform, very clean toilet, mostly available for just anyone who comes to the shop, and the burger and the French fries. So Lotteria was the first, earlier than other big American and other Western the fast food chains. But soon, by the mid-1980s, other global fast food chains also arrived, as we covered, and including American pizza chains. Now, these pizza chains, Domino's and Pizza Hut, gained huge popularity immediately. And now, Koreans would, while eating this pizza, they try to improve it, and later, Korean local companies would dominate a Korean market, and they also entered into big foreign markets in the US. Now, behind this was the big sports event that happened in the end of the 1980s. Now, that includes 1986, the Asian Games. That's the biggest sports event in Asian continent. And 2 years later, 1988, the Summer Olympic Games that hosted in South Korea. And through this event, South Koreans had many foreigners visiting the country, and their income level went up, and soon with liberalized overseas travel, South Koreans became way more globalized. And such a trend continued in the coming decade. Now that has, of course, visible impact on South Korean culinary culture and culinary practices. As I said, by 1989, South Korean government, this is 1 year after the successful hosting of the Summer Olympic Games in 1988, and the government finally liberalized overseas travel. Until then, the only people who could travel overseas were not tourists, but you should have a specific purpose of going overseas. And now that includes like an international student, or you have a business. You have to prove it to go overseas. Then the government will issue you passport. And I remember that before 1989, any South Koreans who wanted to travel overseas for either study or business and so on, they had to take compulsory anti-communism education full day at Korean CIA. Okay? So they would teach you how to behave in overseas, but particularly what to do when you face North Korean spies or Chinese communists and so on. So this was an interesting time in the end of the Cold War, and now that has been finished by 1989, and relatively people, the tourists, could go overseas as well. So in this image, you see that immediately the tourist agencies were advertising special packages, in this case to Hawaii. So Hawaii was a very popular place, and Guam, Saipan. And now the top right, this is a Gimpo International Airport. The Incheon Airport was not built yet, and Gimpo International Airport, during summer vacation, university students as a group, they would go tour for Europe or North America or Japan and so on. And the image at the bottom is in front of a Japanese embassy in the center of Seoul in 1989. Immediately after this liberalization of overseas travel, so many people are waiting to have Japanese visa issued to them. So that tells that people were ready to travel, but government has been controlling it. And after 1989, so many people left the traveled overseas. And you can see that this will, in any country when people are free to travel overseas, that will bring tremendous changes, social changes, and particularly cultural changes, because they will taste the food overseas while traveling, and they bring new taste, and they will bring new ideas, new fashion, and so on and so on. So normally, this impact is very big, and that's exactly what happened in the end of the 1980s and early 1990s. Meanwhile, the society was still very conservative, and some civic groups were actually campaigning against overseas travel. So here in this image, you see that don't go honeymoon overseas. Have it in Korea, okay? Or don't spend too much money. Don't go overseas to play golf. Not anymore. You are wasting our precious foreign currency, okay? So this kind of campaign was going on soon after the liberalization of overseas travels in South Korea. This will continue, but eventually, 1997, when Asian financial crisis hit South Korea, now South Korean behavior, the consumption, everything would be drastically changed. And that's what we will cover in our next session.